And Shantanu, you can get going.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. And hello, everybody. How are you? Hope you are doing well. And we are back with another exciting chapter. And this time, we wanted to cover something that was not covered in our chapter. And this is UiPath test suite and how the testing is performed and how to build test cases. So I like to introduce the session host who will be presenting the details about the testing. Hi, Mason. And talking about Mason, Mason is a UiPath MVP, and he is working in automation space from very long time. Uh, Talking about me, I'm a member of a Canada chapter, and I'm working with Diana and one another member who is not present today. Uh, but yeah, so Mason, all yours.
All right, thanks, Shantanu. So my name is Mason Turvey. Nice to meet you all. I'm going to present a little bit about test-driven development and UiPath testing, just how to build tests, how to think about testing, and kind of the introduction to that. Give a little bit more background about myself while I get the screen shared. I've been a developer in UiPath for about 2 years. I have about 7 years of total development experience. So I come from more like the C# web development background, and I got started in UiPath in 2021 at Total Quality Logistics. You might have seen them. They presented it forward. I was the architect of their platform. Today, I am in a lead engineer role with Privia Health, which is a healthcare partner. And so I've been leading their technical platform for a little over 5 months now. Have a lot of experience doing enterprise scale implementations with UiPath, looking at things like automated testing, CI/CD, best practices, COE standards and whatnot, mostly from a technical perspective. And so testing is one of those big ones that I think it's really important to get right. Because if you want to scale up your program, then it's good to have your developers understand how to build tests, how to test your RPA processes, how to test other applications so other teams can use your testing capabilities and everything. So I'm going to give an overview, and this is kind of focused on test-driven development, which is a type of development, a path that you can take to build projects. So you can use the learnings from this in any type of testing. You can test after the fact. You don't have to specifically use test-driven development or TDD, but I kind of talk about it with that context because I feel like that's a lot easier to do in an agile delivery method. Let's just go into it. Kind of looking at it, we have an intro to that TDD stuff, defining our test cases, and then I just go straight into some demos because I like to get hands-on with it. We're going to look at testing just regular workflows in UiPath Studio, what that looks like when you're testing a library, and then looking at some of the test cases that are already packaged in with the REF if you're doing REF implementation, like dispatchers, performers in UiPath. So those are already there for you to use. So a little bit of an intro to TDD and UiPath testing. So what is TDD? It's a little self-explanatory, but the term is test-driven development. So what that means, if you think about it, it's the test comes first, right? So typically when we're building a process, especially in automation, we have the as-is process. We have what we're trying to automate. And if you think of that from a waterfall perspective, you have your requirements. You know what the thing is supposed to do. And so if you have that, then you can build a test case that tests whether it is specifically doing that thing. So if you treat your robotic process automation, your UiPath workflows, or your library components as functions, then you know they have a standardized input that your stakeholder is giving you or that's generated somewhere, and you're going to have some type of output. And TDD is basically give it the input, give it the output, and let it break because it's not doing anything at the start. and then build that code while you have the test case. So that way you can always run the test case and test the code in a contained environment and eventually develop it out so that it does work and cover all your bases. One thing that I like to talk about is what's the difference between QA and test automation. When we're thinking about like test automation, I like to think of it as like these two circles. QA is really only looking at like business requirements and what your stakeholders are expecting. They're really going to be saying, is this behaving appropriately as the stakeholders are expecting? But when you're doing development, you build a whole lot more other things that are critical to getting that feature across the board. So if you're trying to build everything at once and succeed at your stakeholder-driven tests, you're going to end up with a lot of spaghetti code and messes. But if you're building individual components that are testable, then it's a lot cleaner. So when we're talking about test automation, we're not just testing like business requirements, we're also testing our own technical requirements. So say we've got a process that hits an API at the start, right? We can test just that API functionality, or maybe it's reading and writing a file on the server. We can test just that functionality in isolation. And when we're talking about test automation, we really should be doing all of those little things and building up as if it were a pyramid to the full test. And so that's where the different types of tests, it's really good to know what different types there are out there. So some of the ones, some of the ones that you might have heard of are unit tests and integration tests. Those are pretty common. Unit tests, sometimes they're called smoke tests. So in UiPath context, we're basically just testing a single XAML. So we have one XAML file, we have one library component, we have one specific thing that we're going to be testing. You can have multiple unit tests per XAML. So you could be testing, say you have an if statement or a flowchart that's in there and your data will make it go left or go right, right? You have two different cases. You can build two different test cases to test both of those branches of logic. But typically you're only testing for one thing in a unit test. We're looking for 100% code coverage with our unit tests combined. So as we build out a body of unit tests, you don't want to cover 100% of your code with just one unit test if it's a complex process. If it's a very simple process like a login, then you can definitely hit it all in one unit test. But if it's got multiple branches, then your unit test, you're probably going to hit it with a battery of tests to cover all of that. But the goal is to build enough unit tests to get it as close to 100% code coverage as possible. You want to vary your input data so that you get, different examples of what you might see in production. And a really good practice to use is when you run into bugs in production, to capture the data that's on that bug and recreate that in a test case so that you can always run that on demand and make sure that you have that covered in the future. And the really big one about unit tests that's a little difficult to do with RPA is making sure that it's not dependent on other scripts to run. So what that means is if you're testing a website, a lot of times you have to log in, then you go in and click a button, right? Well, if you have two different unit tests, you don't want your button click one to have to run after your login. So when you're doing a unit test, you want your setup to happen in that unit test. So we would log in, navigate to where we need to go, all of that in the setup, and then do the thing that we need to do. So you can't just run your login test, let it complete, verify it, and then run the next test. You shouldn't sequentially layer your tests like that. You should have everything that one test needs to complete in one test. And then kind of the next level up is integration testing. And this is when you're talking about like multiple XAML or maybe even multiple code deployments. Say you have a dispatcher performer and you want to test the interaction between them. And it's really to kind of figure out what the interactions between multiple pieces are, right? And it's good, just like with unit tests, to build multiple of these to cover one specific instance of an interaction. So say you have one function that generates a data table, and then that data table is going into a different function, right? Or a different XAML. And you want to make sure that those work together. So you could integration test those two in isolation together with each other, just to make sure that they both work. And when we're talking about things like the login into a click button, that could be built as an integration test to make sure that all of your components work at once, right? And you want to focus on a limited number of interactions. So you don't want it to get too complicated, because otherwise then you're just running the full process. And then this third one, this one is where your business requirements come in. This is our functional testing. So this is where we're specifically looking at, this is what the business is expecting. So they're going to give you probably a sample input, and what they're expecting is output. And you got to go in and verify that the process is indeed doing exactly what they're talking about. And you ideally want each of these test cases to map to a specific business requirement, so that we can say, hey, we tested this requirement's good to go, this requirement's good to go. And that gives you a very methodical way to deliver these processes, to make sure that you're covering all your bases and building things the right way. And you get exactly what the business is expecting when it's delivered. So it kind of shows graphically like what these are going to look like. The big difference is, I mean, unit test is a very linear flow. Integration test, it might be multiple components, but it's still kind of linear. And then the last one, it should say functional testing. That's my bad, misspelling there. But the functional test really is the one where there's a big difference here. Instead of just getting our result and verifying it within the test or with a developer, this is where you really want to have business verification and somebody within the business or a stakeholder signing off that process is working correctly. So there's a little bit of a manual input validation step there. So when we're talking about building a test case, and this is from the TDD, test-driven development methodology, when we're building a test case, we want to make sure that we always have business requirements for functional tests. And ideally, we would have some technical requirements from our unit and integration tests. But that takes a lot of time to develop, so you don't always have those. But it's good to at least have an idea of what your requirement is when you're building a new test. Another really good one is writing atomic tests. This is what I talked about with unit tests, making sure that our tests are testing one thing each, and we're building multiple of them to test our different cases. You always start with the simplest ones. So the easiest ones are quite literally the easiest ones to build. So it gives you a base coverage of tests if you can get those out of the way right up front, because you don't always have time to build super complicated test cases. Maybe you just have time to build a bunch of simple ones that get you close to 100% code coverage. So start with those ones. It also means that when you're building your process, it's more piecemeal for you. If you have a really complicated test at the start, then you have to do a lot of building in between when that test is failing and when you get it to succeed. If you start with a very easy one, then it's like you're building code one line at a time and making sure that it works. And then there's this thing in TDD called red-green refactor. What that means is basically when you start, your test should fail, and then you work on it until it succeeds. So you literally make code until the test succeeds, and then optimize and clean that up after the fact without changing that passing result, right? And then this is a big one. So once you've developed it and it works, we're not constantly changing it. Let our test failures guide our development. So when we see a failure, if you're running your tests automatically, then when you see a failure, that should really direct you where our development needs to be focused. That'll give you a nice place to start with your development. And then automating and integrating your tests in your pipelines. If you have source code repositories, you have your build and integration automated, make sure that these test cases are part of that loop so that you can run these on your deployments to make sure that all of your test cases are passing anytime you change your processes. With RPA, it's less of changing and more of deploying the first time, because a lot of processes are we finish them, we deploy them, and then we support them, right? But it's not really a whole lot of change after the fact. But it's good to have those test cases in case there is a big process change, and it's very important on complicated automations to make sure we have that test case coverage. So with all that, I'm going to get into building some test cases for workflows. So I've got Studio.
So
Can you guys see? Yeah, go ahead.
Before starting the module, I just wanted to ask you, while building this test-driven development module, do we need to associate any QAs or any tester, because ideally they will be the prime person who will find the bugs, or they have the tendency to find the bugs in the code. So like, do we require any QA, or is like it is the job of the developer to think like a tester and build the scenario in such development?
So the great part about that is the answer to that is it always depends. And what it normally depends on is what your team and culture and your organization looks like. If you have dedicated QA resources on your team, they might be looking at UiPath. And if they are, that's great. You know, you can offload a lot of that, like looking at the testing, looking at the production code, capturing, faulting and everything that's going on there. They'll handle a lot of that. If you don't have that staffing, then a lot of times it falls back on the developer to make sure that that works, right? If you have an architect but not a QA, I find that the architects kind of play that quality role, doing a lot of like code reviews, looking at production data to make sure things are running, and doing a lot of like the data analytics that informs like development. And a really big one is making sure your stakeholders are also looking at the quality of the code, because once it's in production, the person who's still interacting and owns the process is that stakeholder. So if they see something wrong, it's pretty easy for them to say, hey, this isn't behaving right. And a lot of times then you don't even really need to, you have not necessarily a test case, but you have a quality check at least there while the process is in production. And so it's a community, right? There's a whole lot of people that are involved in the support, but from a testing perspective, normally it's that QA or developer that it falls on. And then sometimes the stakeholder might be involved as well.
Yep. Thank you.
Yep. All right. So this is a workflow that I designed. It's a very simple one. Basically what it does is it goes out to the RPA challenge website and enters in just the email. And we built a test case so that we can check that out. Give me a second. I want to show you guys the website just to give you some context here. There we go. So this is the RPA challenge website. If you've gone through the UiPath Academy training, you've probably seen this before. When you click the submit button, these input fields change, the selectors change. So this is a really good dynamic web page for you to build code to just test yourself. If you can build RPA processes that do basic input. We're going to build a test case that enters in the email, right? And then verifies that that email was entered. So I'm gonna go over here, this demo process. So I already have this code. So this code uses the browser. It doesn't open it. So I have it never open, never close. It types into the email with an input argument. And so that input argument is just in email. We've got all the other ones on here, but we're just doing the email for right now. So I want to test this. So this is a separate workflow in my project. I could have called it a main if I needed to. I could just run it right now to see if it works, but specifically I want to be able to test this, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a test case. So I'll right click my XAML here and create a test case. And then I typically just name it test case underscore whatever the thing is. So this is enter RPA challenge.
So Mason, are you sharing your studio screen? Because I don't.
Oh, is it not sharing studio?
No.
Gosh darn it. Well, give me a second. There's so many different platforms. We use Google Workspace at work, so that's the one that I'm used to. Let's see. How do you share the whole screen? I can just share the studio screen. That'll work. There, how's that look?
Yeah.
You guys see the new test case window here? This guy? that I'm dragging around?
Yep.
Yeah,
All right, cool. So I'll go back a little bit. So we've got this workflow. This is the enter RPA challenge form. It opens up the RPA challenge website. You know what? Actually, I can't just share the window, because if I do that, you won't be able to see the thing actually entering stuff in. There we go. There's the screen. There we go. All right. So we've got this workflow. We've got the input argument of email, right? It's only typing in the email. Here on this use browser, I've set it to never close, never open. And so I'm going to build a test case for this guy. I'm going to create a test case. So I'm right-clicking the XAML here. You can create a test case this way, or you can go, up to process, add, and you can add sequences, right? And once you have a sequence, then you can right-click it. Say I did this for main, I could convert it to a test case. You can't do that for main, but you can do that for any other sequence. And that's how you would create a test case without creating a test case for a specific individual one. So I'm going to create the test case from this. And this is the naming convention that I apply for my test cases. So I always do, there's a formula here. Test case to start, I just put that. I'm very verbose in my naming conventions for everything. And then I put the thing that I'm testing. So this is my XAML enter RPA challenge form. And then I put the name of the test case. So this one, I'm going to email input, or input email. So very simple. We know it's test case. We know it's testing this XAML. It's testing the input on the email, right? If we had the address, we could build another one that said input address and have a bunch of test cases that test all of those. Right? So what you see here, when a test case is generated, there is a specific methodology to testing. And that one of the ones that is typically used, and you see it most commonly for software unit testing and just testing in general, is the given, when, then. And so what this means is we have this given sequence here in the start. Our given sets things up, right? That is, given this circumstance, this happens, right? So at the very start, we set things up in given. And then in the when, this is what we're actually testing. So in this case, we're testing enter RPA challenge form, right? So given this, when this, right? So when this happens, when we do this. And then the very final thing is then. So this is our validation, verification, and cleanup. So we will check to see that the thing worked, and we'll also close out, log out, and do anything that we need to clean up after the test case here. All right. So for this one, because our enter RPA challenge form, we're not actually opening the website. So I want to give a little bit of example of what you would do in a given. So I'm going to take this use browser. I'm just going to copy and paste it here. Da-da-da. So what I have here now is a use browser on the rpachallenge.com. And I'm going to set it to never close and always open. So what this will do is open my browser. So I'm basically setting up for my test case, because my test case, my workflow doesn't actually open that. I'm going to open it here, right? Now, this is kind of a data-driven test. If it was a smoke test, I would just run it, open it in the given, and then close it in the then, which I can go ahead and do that as well. Make sure the website's closed here. Right, so we clean up after ourselves. This would be basically a smoke test. There's no functionality, really. We're not validating anything. We're just making sure it works. When we say smoke test, basically we're trying to not get an exception. That is really the only requirement for a smoke test, is no exceptions. And we would get an exception here because we don't have our email, right? So we would need that, at least that email input on this one. So let's go ahead and give that just an XYZ at abc.com. So that's our test case. And then at any point we can run this test case. So we could debug it here. We could run it here. There is another little menu over here, and it's kind of hard to see, but this is your test explorer over here in Studio. And so when you build a test case, they will show up here in the test explorer. So we've got this guy here. That's our test, and we can run it from here, debug it from here. We can add test data, and do a lot of different other things. We can also link it to Test Manager in Orchestrator. I'm not going to cover Test Manager because it's a whole nother like product suite in UiPath. But if you wanted to do like business testing and hook that up to like ADO or some other, or Jira or some other system, then you can do that with Test Manager. That's kind of what that's for. What's really cool about this this test explorer is you can run all of your tests. It shows you like what they call. So this test is calling enter RPA challenge form. You can see we don't have any tests for main. So if we wanted to test main, we could build a test case and call in main. What's really cool is if I dropped main in here, you'll see it update, right? So we go up here, I gotta save it. And now, boom, this test case shows up, it's testing main. So we know what all tests are hitting main. It's a pretty neat feature. So one thing about the given when then, these aren't binding in any way. They don't have any like specific functionality. It's just something for you to like organize it. If I put main like up here in given, it'll still show up in my test case, right? And anything that happens in the given and the then will get validated. So you'll get code coverage on those. So they aren't functionally different. They're just there to organize what's going on in the test. All right, so let's go ahead and run this test just real quick. So give it a run, make sure it works. And it runs just like a XAML file. There's nothing different going on there. So it opens a new one. Should input an email. I'm hoping. All right. So what we see here is we've got a passed test case, right? So that green check means that it passed. But you'll see that it didn't actually enter the email here. So technically that test should have failed. This is where like a smoke test will pass, but it won't do the validation necessary. It won't do that next step to make sure that it is actually working. So smoke tests are good up to a certain point until you have data. And so I want to cover a little bit about like what looking at data within our tests looks like. So we can put in different emails, different addresses, and test against those and make sure that they're going in correctly. We can do that with this add test data button here. And you can use existing data. There we go. Let's see. So I have this data set pulled in already. This is what that looks like. So we've got John Smith at itsolutions.co.uk, just a random person generated. To generate this test data, we could also use Excel. Unfortunately, I don't have Excel on this laptop. I don't have it licensed, so I can't actually use Excel to show you. But when you're entering this test data, you can do a file. You can also use data service. You can use a queue, or you could auto-generate it. And this kind of uses like an AI model to build your data for you. So if you have like a simple person generator or just an email, auto-generates a really nice one for that. It also works with like addresses and everything. When you select this file, you could choose an Excel file, and it'll basically take the column names as input arguments, and it will generate a battery of test cases to run against your test. So if you go down here to arguments, right now there are none, but if I add this test case or add this test data, I'm going to add challenge one sheet. Now we have test cases that show up underneath of this test case. So we've got the first one, and that's because there's only one in here right now. So we've got first name John, last name Smith. We look at our arguments, and now there's a lot of arguments in this XAML file, in this test case file. So we've got all of those data fields that were available in that test data. And if there was a second row, a third row, or a fourth row, when you run this one, it would run all four of those and use the different data sets for each one. So if I had a John Smith and then the second row was like Sally Smith, then I could run his email and then her email and then validate both of them kind of at the same time, right? Curious if I could just do that right here to kind of show you guys. So this is just a JSON object. Control C. Can add more data in here, I hope. Boom. And then I would have to update my test data, right? Using the same test data. Already in use. It's annoying. That doesn't want to work right now. That's fine. Try one more time. Did I not save that file? So I would typically go through the Excel way to do this. I find that to be a lot easier than this test data one. So you just generate an Excel file and add another row and then update your test data from there. It's pretty easy to work with. And you can also use data service is a good way to design things. So those are two options for you. But if I want to run this guy, I could, run with first name John, just run that test, let it go. Continue. Open the website, typing it in. Something's wrong with my browser automation. That's fine. It also generates output so you can see exactly what's going on there. What's that? All right. And then that one passed. So we still don't have really a validation here. So the next thing that I want to do is actually build that validation. And there's multiple ways to do that. A really good one is in that test package. So I have that pulled in here. Let's take a look at that. This UiPath.testing.activities. This is the package that gives you activities that run for test cases. You'll find it right here in testing. So there's data activities. These are like randomly generating data, test data queues. So all of your queue activities, or well, some of your queue activities, not all of them, but some of your queue related activities just with test data queues. So it works the same way as a regular queue, just with test data. And then these verification ones are the cool ones. So there's 4 different ones in here. There's verify range. This is specifically for Excel, I believe. Or no, it's not. There we go. So this is like a min max, right? So you have got a lower limit, an upper limit. It's within that. So say your test is supposed to come in with plus or minus 10 cents on the dollar or something like that. That would be kind of like a business rule. You can put that in here. Expression with operator is very simple. You've got different operators. It can be equal, not equal, greater than or equal, less than or equal, contains. Or you can use regex. And then you put your first expression in here, second one in here. So if this equals that, then we're good to go. And then verify expression is a very simple one. You just type in your VB expression in here. So if I was to do the equal one, I could say X equals Y, or if you're using C#, it would be equal, right? Different ways to use that one. And then this verify control attribute, this one's a cool one. So on this one, we can put in a UI activity, right? And test that. So this is the one that I'm actually going to use to validate this one. So I'm going to go ahead and open this site. So we've got our RPA challenge site. I'm going to take this test case, and here at the end, I'm going to verify that something is correct on this. And I'm going to basically look at get text. I'm going to actually, now that I think about it, I don't think this will work this way. So the way that this verify control attribute works is you have to use your, oh, I'm forgetting the name of the activity now. There it is, check app state. So in the modern activities, it's called check app state. It used to be called element exists. So you put check app state in here and you indicate it. We're going to check our email, right? I'm going to turn on the strict selector, turn off the fuzzy selector. Just use that. Looks like it got our anchor too, so that's all good. I'm going to toggle those branches off so we get to see it a little bit easier. All right. And so now what we have is basically these different output on this activity. So we can get a result, we can get the output element, right? And that's the output on this activity, right? So looking at that, we've got result and we've got output element. So we could check those. If you were going to use a get text on here, you would have to use the use browser. So we could actually just drop it in here. Drop it in here. See it. Is it not up here? Go back to testing. Verification, verify control attribute. How can you not drop that inside now? Not that one. This one. Oh. Verify control attribute. Because your get text needs a use browser on it. So if you're going to get text, you have to be inside of a use browser. So now we can indicate that. Grab our email again. Get rid of that fuzzy selector. Get rid of that computer vision. Don't need that. There we go. So now we got that. So we can save it to something. We don't necessarily need to because we have this. So this grabs our text. So we have our get text and we actually have our email as one of the input arguments to our test case. So we can verify specifically that the control that we tried to input on equals our email, right? So that would mean that we typed it correctly. We could also say in this one, we can just validate that a control exists, right? So at the end of it, just say, hey, does this exist? Like say you click submit and then there's an OK button. Does that OK button show up or does the next screen show up? That's another thing that you can do. You can get really modular with it. You can put multiple of these verification checks in here. What's really cool is when you run your tests, you'll see passed, failed, right? And when you go into the individual test itself, you can see assertions and exceptions. So this is an assertion. So this verify control attribute is an assertion. and an exception is just, literally an exception. So if there's an exception during the test case, you'll get to see that. If one of your assertions failed, you'll get to see that, and you'll get to see which one specifically failed. So if we run this guy, give it a quick debug. All right, so here our assertion failed, right? So if we go in here, our test case failed. We got one failed assertion, and it gives us a nice little thing. It says the output value of text string xyz at abc.com was not equal to the expected value John Smith. So the reason for that is because we still have xyz.com right here. So what this kind of shows is your test cases, while they do test, requirements, it also makes sure that you've got things right. So if you have a data-driven test case and you're putting the wrong argument in there, that that I didn't even think about changing that when we were, adding the test data. So that's something that you can fix in your test cases or in your XAMLs that are calling other XAMLs. It kind of gives you that extra layer of defense to make sure that you're programming things the right way and you catch these things in development, right? It's always easy to rerun your test case and just keep working on it until it succeeds, right? And that's kind of the mentality of test-driven development, is we get a failure and then we just keep going until it succeeds as expected. Add more test cases, add more code, just keep iterating over it. But we always want the test cases to succeed at the end of the day, right? I was really thinking about it this time. No, it's because there's two open. Yeah, so it's going to fail again. Got to remember to close the tab. There we go. Stop that real quick. Run it from here. It's about to fail again. Maybe we'll get to see a failure with an exception. That'd be exciting. What are we having trouble with here? Okay, so that validation is having trouble. That's fine. So take a look at this guy. Now we can see we've got that exception. Not sure what's going on there. I think it's because I'm using multiple Chrome profiles. UiPath has a tendency not to like that. So probably my bad. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of that. But that is how you would do validations. You can do that with this is obviously like UI automation, but you can do that with data tests as well, right? So if you're generating a data table, you could, query parts of that data table, make sure that it's correct. You could do the same thing with like data service or integration service endpoints. You can really test anything that you want in this SAML that's in the when, right? So it's a really good opportunity to make sure that even your like subroutines that aren't doing any UI automation work, right? So maybe you have something that's, I don't know, using ChatGPT to autocomplete something. You can make an API call, make sure that those things work by testing them the same way that you would your UI automation, right? Basically all of your code no matter how small or how big, should have some kind of test case covering it. That way, you know that it works and you can test that whenever you need to. Let's see, we've got 13 minutes left, looks like. Is that right on time, Diana? Sends it 5 EST, I think. So
Yeah, we are right on time. Sorry.
sweet. Thanks. I'm going to skip over the, so you can do this with libraries too. It is the exact same. There's nothing different. So you could build a library. This is how I typically do it. I don't typically use my processes with test cases. I'll do my integration tests in my process a lot of times and run through that. And then I'll do all of my other test cases in a library. I pretty much have a library per process that has all of my workflows and XAMLs, and I'll test those XAMLs in the library. When you're done building your test cases, another really cool feature is you can publish them. So when you go here to publish, click this little drop down, you can publish your test cases. Those will show up in Orchestrator. Let's take a look at it actually. Just to give you guys an idea of what that looks like. You get to see my personal Orchestrator here. If you go over to this testing tab, right? So this is a folder. So when you deploy an automation, it normally shows up in your package feed, and then you can put it in automations. When you deploy tests, they also deploy as NuGet feed, and then you can add a test set. So if you've deployed one, then you could add the test set from that project, right? So that's a cool feature. And then once you have that there, you can run those test cases. So you'll run them from a test set. You'll get a test execution. You can schedule them. So you can schedule them to run regularly and make sure that they work. And then you can also have those test data queues. It works the same way as a regular queue. It's just for test data, right? So you can test your processes using this testing tab. You don't even need Test Manager to run tests regularly. You can run scheduled tests, make sure your automations are working, all from just Orchestrator. And deploying those test cases is how you would do it, just from here in Studio. So that's a really cool feature. There's also some more stuff here in this Test Explorer that you could look at. There's not all of your tests are just, make sure something works. Sometimes you want to make sure that it's running in the correct amount of time. So there's multiple ways to do that, but there's timing here. So you have execution time, you have your coverage. So how much of your code is covered, you have your data that's on there. And you could always do an assertion with the time to make sure that it's timed correctly. So you could do, regression testing and make sure that your automations are running in their SLA time. You can get as creative as you need to with it. It's a very expandable, easy to use testing interface for you. And if you're used to building RPI automations, you have all the flexibility that you need right here. Right? It's just like building a XAML. It's just called a test case, right? But it's the same thing as building a XAML file. So what I want to talk about after this is more on kind of the REF and looking at that. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I just want you guys to kind of see the evolution of the REF. You might be used to kind of how the REF looked on like 21.4, 21.10, 22 versions. Well, now we have test cases in the REF when you pull it down. So I pulled this one down fresh. I think this is in 23.4 was when I pulled this one down. So you have a get transaction data, init all applications, init all settings, the main test case. Didn't mean to open that, but you can look at it. You have your process test case, your workflow test case. This workflow test case is a generic one, so you can put any workflow in there, and you can copy and paste it, so you can test all your workflows. This is in this tests folder. These ones, I kind of treat them like smoke tests, right? Because you're just going to run them. Init all applications should run, and all settings should run as expected. You shouldn't really have to change this test case too much. There's logging already implemented here for you, so you can see where it's at. In the given, it'll set up. So for init all applications to run in your RAF, you normally need init all settings to run first, right? Because you need your config. So it's already set up in the then, or in the given. And then in when, we have init all applications. And then what's really nice in the then, boom, we have close all applications. So nothing's left open. So it cleans up after itself. One thing to watch out for with test cases, though, is you might even want to build like exception handling like you would with the REF. If you think about it, when you have an application exception, close all applications happens, right? So you make sure that things are closed. Well, if you're running a test case and it's logging into a VM somewhere and it's opening the thing and the test case fails, it doesn't get to close all applications. You might want to have a fail safe, right? Something that I do in my test cases is I have a try catch that ends in a close all applications, just in case. Then that way I make sure that, yes, everything did close at the end of that test case. So you always want to make sure that you're closing those things. So that's one good edit that you can make to these. The process test case is the one that I typically use for pretty much everything. I'll put my business test cases in here, put the data in, make sure it looks good. It'll get a transaction from the queue, and then it'll process that transaction and pass it in. And then you can verify that it worked, right? And then it closes all applications. So that's a really nice one. You can customize this one and set it up to work for a number of transactions, copy and paste it, make sure that it's working for the different transactions. You could even go so far as to load the transaction in beforehand, right? So have your arguments go in for your test case, create the transaction, and then pull that specific transaction that you just created into this, right? There's nothing stopping you from doing any of that. But this is a good like starting off point in the RAF. So it comes every time you pull in a new RAF, you're going to have these test cases. So they're already there for you to start using. And with that, I think that's about it. That's about all I want to cover. We can get into questions if there are any.
Sure, if people want to take themselves off mute and ask any questions, that'd be great.
I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, if no one has question, I have one question. So Mason, like how it is different from legacy development, because like when you do a legacy development, you follow the same structure. You do the unit testing, you do the SIT, and then you do the UAT. But only thing is like SIT is done by QA and UAT is done by stakeholders. So how it is different, and like what is like benefit in this?
Yeah, so a lot, you're kind of digging into development philosophy here a little bit. So traditionally, with your old waterfall approaches, legacy development, whatever you want to call that, it wasn't necessarily that the process was wrong, right? We were doing things the same way. It was that the communication wasn't there. And if you work in an RPA department, you might have run into this a couple of times where, you're waiting on other teams to get things done. Like QA can be a huge bottleneck. A lot of times at the places that I've worked, QA just doesn't even get involved with RPA because they don't know what it's about. They don't know, they don't have the capacity to learn UiPath. So really this allows our like UiPath developers to test their own solutions. And so it's driving towards a unified team that can do it all. And that's what we're seeing a lot of shifts in development. I think probably towards the turn of the cloud era. You look at Amazon after 2008 when they adopted Agile and everything. You have a lot of cross-functional teams that aren't sitting in silos that can do their whole shebang. They go from the data, they stand up their own infrastructure, their own architecture, and then they do their testing on the backside. They do stakeholder communications, and they have a multifaceted team. If you think about an RPA department, right, we're building custom solutions. We might be testing other applications and working with those other teams that own those, but largely we're probably going to want our own team to be self-defining of their own velocity. So it's good to have these test skills on your team specifically. In test-driven development, make sure that the developer owns those tests. So when the code is developed, the test is also developed. And you could have a QA resource just looking at those tests, but really it's the onus is on that developer to get those done. And it speeds up your development process throughout that. So you're not waiting on that QA resource or that QC resource every time.
Okay, got it.
Any other questions? So I think we have one.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Shantanu.
Yeah, so the question is like, is it correct to assume that this is a development application used to unit test?
So yeah, I would say for test suite, which is really your testing Explorer and Studio, and then the test thing that I showed in Orchestrator, that's really for the developers. It's a very technical thing. I wouldn't expect somebody who's not technical to be able to use that or understand it. When you're looking at Test Manager, that is a product that's more focused on that QA persona. And so they'll be like, Test Manager is really focused on building like the verbatim English test, right? So given, when, then, and then they write out the test case, and then assign. It's really not even building test cases. They're just assigning the test cases that already exist in Orchestrator to something in Test Manager, right? So what I've shown today is really for developers to be able to build the test cases. Test Manager is more of that like QA tool. If they're getting involved and they need to have, you know, tests linked to requirements, then Test Manager is the right tool for that.
So means test manager is like more of a verification and validation purpose where you can set the data up and you can schedule the test cases, but the actual testing will be done inside your test cases in UiPath.
Exactly. Exactly.
Great questions. So I also put where the recording will be tomorrow, the URL. So make sure you guys copy that. And Mason, if you send me your presentation, I'll post that as well.
For sure. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, great job, Mason and Shantanu.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Yeah. See you guys next time for our next sessions. Thanks.
Thank you everyone for joining.
See you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.